1848, Louisiana. The year itself carried weight. Just 3 years after statehood had been reaffirmed, and the violence of the Mexican-American War still lingered in the minds of veterans drifting homeward. In that year, at the edge of a low parish town pressed between cypress swamp and cotton road, there stood a building that locals never learned to call a refuge. They named it Pilgrims Rest. Its walls were pale clapboard and its roofline plain, yet every soul who stepped near it remembered only the windows. Dozens of them, narrow-paned, tall as men, set in a rigid grid that looked outward, not onto orchards, not onto streets, not onto gardens, but upon a cemetery so crowded that fresh soil never had time to settle. From inside, no matter your room, no matter your floor, the view was only one thing: graves. Some shallow, some sinking, or close enough that moonlight cast their headstones in across the asylum's floors like unwanted visitors. It is this single design feature that makes Pilgrims Rest unlike any other institution of its era. When men spoke of it, they began not with its charity, not with its staff, not with its deacons, but with that chilling claim: every window faced the dead. And when women whispered warnings to children to keep away, they leaned close and said, they built it that way on purpose. Before we proceed, a note for those listening today. What follows is a dramatized reconstruction based on recovered parish ledgers, coded journals and testimony preserved in fragments. Some details cannot be confirmed, others may remain forever disputed. We will not linger on the violence itself, but we will trace its shadow honestly. This is not a story for all ears. Take care of yourself as you listen. Those who lived then, farmers who passed the asylum at dusk, washerwomen who heard the faint cries in the night air, remembered the contrast most sharply. Our house declared a sanctuary, yet built as though it were already a mausoleum. On one side of the clapboard walls, prayers and psalms were spoken over troubled souls. On the other side, the very soil sagged with coffins, sunken by flood and rot. For the townsfolk, Pilgrims Rest did not bridge the living and the dead, it collapsed them together. The truth of its founding and its failure is tangled in church minutes, in a sheriff's scattered notes, and in the trembling lines of one young woman's diary. From these a pattern emerges, not of accident but of intention. You will hear of night chimes no one admitted to ringing, of burials no record ever named, of light glowing in every window when no lamps could be bought. You will hear of authority divided, civic duty against church decree, medical judgment against moral reputation, and you will hear how, in the end, it was silence, not answers, that the parish decreed. But let us not rush forward. Each grave visible from those windows belonged to someone once spoken of in town, then never spoken of again. Every window, every view was a reminder. There is no recovery, only resting with the pilgrims gone before. The dead were placed not outside the institution, but within its gaze, part of the cure, part of the control. If you are listening now, consider this as we continue. How would you live if every glance outward forced you to look upon a grave? If your one source of light was shaped by stone markers, not open skies? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and tell us too where you are listening from. This tale winds through soil, scripture, and secrecy, but it begins with windows that never offered the living a way back to life. The place was chosen less for its promise than for its cheapness. In the 1840s, land on the edge of the parish marsh sold for pennies, and so it was there, on half-flooded soil a mile from the levee road, that the deacons laid their plans. They spoke of mercy and of godly duty. They called their venture Pilgrims Rest, drawing on scripture that praised the weary, who had fought the good fight and earned their repose. In their minutes they recorded words of sanctuary, of compassion, of a safe retreat for the afflicted in mind. Yet to the laborers, who were paid to hammer boards and set beams, it was plain from the start that the building was not raised like any other refuge. The walls went up tall but thin, the rooms narrow, the windows impossibly long and oriented without variation, all toward the cemetery lot the church had purchased alongside. The contrast was immediate. On paper, the asylum promised hope. In its bones, it offered only discipline and death. Local farmers who passed with wagons of cane stalks or cotton bales remarked that the chosen site was sour ground, a place where mosquitoes thrived, and the damp rose through boards to rot shoes. Yet the deacons insisted that isolation was necessary for quiet reflection. That stillness of mind was more easily obtained in places where worldly distractions were absent. Parishioners cowed by pulpit authority did not object. The context of the time cannot be ignored. Louisiana in 1848 was marked by a sharp divide between faith and the stirrings of medical modernity. Alienists in New Orleans were beginning to speak of nervous disorders, melancholia, and treatments rooted in observation rather than scripture. But in the rural parishes it was the church that still dictated what became of those who could not conform to the rhythms of farm and family. Pilgrims Rest was not built as a hospital. It was built as a moral corrective. Families who sent their kin there did so not with hope of cure, but with the grim belief that obedience might be beaten or prayed back into them. The cemetery was prepared even before the wards were completed. Men with shovels carved rows of trenches into the swampy ground, driving cedar boards into the mud to hold the soil. Headstones, rough-carved and unpolished, were ordered in advance from a mason in Baton Rouge. For those who noticed, the order seemed odd. Stones carved before there were patients to bury, yet the deacons recorded it as foresight, claiming they wished to spare grieving families undue delay. Inside the parish hall where plans were presented, there was little opposition. Those who wondered why so much money was being spent on graves rather than beds were silenced with the reminder that charity must include provision for the soul's final passage. The meeting minutes survived, their ink faded, but one phrase has been copied more than once: "They shall find their rest among the pilgrims of the Lord." Thus the place took shape. Clapboard walls that leaked in summer rains, narrow beds set in rows, corridors that smelled of fresh-cut pine. And in every chamber, tall windows were set not to the sun's path, nor to the breezes that might cool fevered skin, but squarely toward the rising cemetery hill. Patients would never look on a horizon, never glimpse the bustle of wagons or the curve of the bayou, only the silent stone markers lined in relentless rows. To the deacons this was design. To the community it was an oddity. To those who would one day sleep inside, it was a promise already broken, that their lives would be measured not in recovery, but in proximity to the grave. The foundation of Pilgrims Rest was laid in the name of salvation. But in practice it sank into the mire, caught between mercy preached and cruelty enacted. The first weeks after Pilgrims Rest opened passed quietly enough that the parish congratulated itself. A handful of patients were admitted, mostly women whose families could not manage their melancholy, a veteran still trembling from the war, and a boy of only 12 whose fits frightened his kin. They were given cots, a daily portion of bread and beans, and a schedule of prayer overseen by the deacons. From the outside the place seemed to function, though the windows gave the uneasy impression of an audience of mourners always watching. But one night in the autumn of 1848, that illusion of peace was broken by a sound that no one could explain. It began with the faint tolling of a bell. Those who heard it swore it came from within the asylum walls, deep and resonant. A church bell's note, though there was no steeple. No tower, no iron bell hung in the building. At first the patients heard it, and their accounts, preserved in half-burnt pages of journals, describe them rising from their beds in confusion, believing the hour was midnight mass. Then the attendants heard it, stumbling down corridors, striking matches, demanding to know who was pulling a rope that did not exist. The contrast was jarring. An institution dedicated to silence and reflection, suddenly shaken by a voice of metal that should not have been there. Neighbors in the fields later said they too heard the sound drifting across the swamp, heavy and deliberate. 10 strikes, then silence, then 10 again. Yet when the sheriff inquired, the deacons dismissed it as hysteria, claiming the patients were prone to illusions, and that rumors spread quickly through gullible country folk. What deepened the unease was the persistence. The bell tolled again a week later, then again the following month. Each time witnesses described the same rhythm, always at night, always when the moon sat low over the cemetery. Nurses kept no official notes, but one scribbled a line in the margin of a prayer book. The grave seemed to answer the bell, as if it calls not the living, but the resting. That fragment was later torn out and hidden, surfacing only when the book was sold at estate auction decades later. Inside the asylum, the tolling became a marker of dread. Patients spoke of it as a summons, staring out the long windows toward the cemetery, counting the chimes on their fingers. One woman, confined for her excessive grief, is said to have whispered, "That bell isn't ringing for us inside. It is ringing for those just outside, to remind us our place is with them." The attendants tried to silence such talk, but fear spread like damp across floorboards. The bell left no trace. No rope fibers, no hammer, no resonance chamber in the timber frame. The contrast could not be clearer. Rational inquiry found nothing. Testimony insisted everything. The sheriff recorded complaints, noting that several families now hesitated to send their kin, fearing that the asylum was haunted or worse, designed to mock the afflicted with reminders of death. Yet the parish council insisted the asylum continue, its funds dependent on keeping doors open. Thus the first incident etched itself into memory, not a crime proven, not a phenomenon explained, but a pattern of unease that could not be dismissed. In the nights after the bells, more patients began to mutter prayers facing their windows, some kneeling toward the graves rather than toward the cross. Order still reigned in daylight, but in darkness, Pilgrims Rest belonged to something else. Among the few tangible fragments that remain from Pilgrims Rest, none are as haunting as the diary of a young woman named Mary Legrand. She was 22 when her family delivered her to the asylum, describing her to parish authorities as sunk in grief and unable to labor. The death of her infant son had left her withdrawn, and in an era where sorrow was quickly labeled hysteria, she was confined under the watch of the deacons. By all accounts, she had been literate and meticulous, and it was through that skill that she left behind testimony that would survive, long after the asylum itself was shuttered. Her journal is a slim, leather-bound book, its pages stained by humidity and spotted by mildew. The handwriting wavers between steady lines and hurried scrawls, as though some entries were written in the daylight with time to reflect, and others scratched in stolen moments, under fear of discovery. It is from her words that the first clear human perspective inside Pilgrims Rest emerges, a voice that breaks through the official reports and self-serving sermons. Mary wrote most often of the windows. She described lying on her cot, staring through iron bars at the cemetery beyond. Her words echo the same refrain, that no matter where she moved in the room, her eyes found gravestones, rows upon rows, white in the moonlight. She spoke of the soil's constant dampness, how some graves seemed to sink almost overnight, headstones tilting as though swallowed. "The dead are restless here," she wrote, "and we are made to keep watch." The contrast she painted was unmistakable. She was told she was in a place of healing, yet all her sight, all her days and nights, were ordered toward death. The journal describes the first bell night from her own perspective. Mary noted that the sound began low, like a distant riverboat bell, though she knew no boats ran that late. She rose from her bed, joined by other women in the ward, and together they counted the tolls. 10 times it rang, she recorded. 10 times we stared at the graves, and on the 10th, I thought I saw a figure rise, or else the ground moved beneath my eyes. She begged forgiveness for writing such things, for even her own hand trembled to admit what she thought she had seen. Yet she returned to the page again days later, unable to shake the impression that the sound had not come to her ears but to her bones. Mary's writings also reveal the atmosphere of repression inside. She noted that when she and others spoke of the bell, attendants warned them against sinful imagination. Patients were forbidden to discuss what they had heard. Yet Mary insisted she felt safer writing the truth than swallowing it. At one point she confessed in the margins, "If they take this book from me, I will bury it in the straw beneath my cot. For better to lose my hand than to lose the memory." One of her most chilling entries falls in the weeks after repeated bell tolls. She described how other women had begun to sit at their windows as though keeping vigil over the cemetery. Some whispered prayers not for their own deliverance, but for the dead outside. Mary confessed she too felt drawn, compelled even to gaze toward the tilted stones. "It is as if the windows do not look out," she wrote, "but in that they are the eyes of the dead, and we merely look through them." Her testimony is proof of the inner life of Pilgrims Rest, a life that parish records sought to erase. While official accounts described a house of order, Mary painted a picture of a place saturated with dread, where the architecture itself pressed despair into every waking hour. The contrast between her careful handwriting, orderly and reasoned, and the accusations of madness used to silence her could not be sharper. Her journal is not the scribble of delirium, it is the quiet voice of someone compelled to bear witness. Through her words, we glimpse what official reports would never admit, that the asylum was not a refuge from grief, but a factory of it, a place where sorrow was neither healed nor released, only magnified by the ever-present reminder of the graveyard. Her pages serve as the first undeniable artifact, not of benevolence or piety, but of a deliberate cruelty masked as care. By the winter of 1848, whispers in the parish shifted from curiosity to suspicion. The bells had stirred unease, but it was the ground itself that began to speak louder than rumor. Farmers who passed the asylum on the road at dawn started noticing patches of freshly turned soil in the cemetery adjoining Pilgrims Rest. What troubled them was not that burials were taking place. The cemetery was meant to serve both patients and townsfolk, but that no one in town seemed to know who had died. No announcements were made from the pulpit, no obituaries written into the parish register. Yet the earth was restless, rising in neat mounds again and again, as though someone was quietly laying bodies to rest in the night. The contrast was stark. In a society where funerals were public rituals, where bells tolled and neighbors gathered to escort the departed to their grave, here there was silence. Graves appeared as if conjured, without name, without prayer, without witness. This secrecy struck deep at the trust that had barely held the asylum together. For many it confirmed the uneasy impression that Pilgrims Rest had never been meant as a house of care, but as a place to disappear the inconvenient. Accounts from the time describe neighbors halting their wagons to count the new markers. Some swore they saw as many as 5 in a single week, though no death certificates had been posted at the courthouse. A washerwoman named Celeste later testified that she saw lanterns moving among the stones after midnight, 3 men shoveling, 2 more carrying what looked like a narrow pine box. She said she paused long enough to hear the scrape of wood against earth and the muffled thud of dirt thrown in, then fled before they could see her. Her testimony never reached official court, but her family repeated the story until it became part of the parish's oral history. Inside the asylum, Mary Legrand's journal again provides a glimpse of how these secret burials pressed upon the living. She wrote of waking to the sound of muffled shovels, the rhythm of dirt striking wood. She could not see the graves directly from her window, but she described lantern light passing over the stones like stars that never rose. The next morning, she wrote, the soil was fresh and dark, and she counted 3 new mounds from her place at the bars. No name, no hymn, she recorded. We watched them go into the earth as if they were never here. The parish council attempted to explain the new graves as pauper burials, arguing that indigent patients were given quick interment to spare families the cost. Yet when the sheriff inquired about records, he found none. No dates, no causes of death, no signatures. For every grave he saw, there should have been a paper trail, but the ledgers showed only blank columns and ink scratches. His frustration is preserved in a single line he later wrote into his private notebook. The earth remembers what the parish denies. As rumors spread, attendance at Sunday services faltered. Some families refused to pass the asylum at night, taking the longer road around the marsh. Mothers warned children not to play near the fence. The cemetery, once meant as a sanctified space, now became a source of dread, a silent ledger of lives unaccounted for. The second incident marked a sharp escalation. The first bells could be dismissed as fancy, as the echoes of troubled minds. But earth is harder to deny. Graves do not dig themselves, and headstones do not appear without the labor of hands. Yet when questions were asked, the answers only deepened the silence. Pilgrims Rest stood firm against inquiry, and the deacons reminded their flock that to pry too closely into the work of the asylum was to doubt the mercy of the church itself. Still, those fresh graves bore witness to something beyond mercy. They testified to a pattern of concealment, to burials stripped of ritual and memory, and they pressed an unspoken question upon the community. If the cemetery was filling so quickly, how long before the windows of the asylum stared not upon a resting ground, but upon a field of the forgotten? Sheriff Etienne Duval had worn the badge of the parish for nearly 2 decades, long enough to know the difference between rumor and record. By the end of 1848, as graves multiplied without certificates, he grew certain that Pilgrims Rest was concealing more than grief. Duval was a cautious man, fluent in both French and English, respected by planters and laborers alike. He had settled disputes over land, tracked runaway convicts, and presided over inquests after duels, yet the asylum unsettled him in ways no pistol duel ever had. Its quietness was unnatural, its windows staring outward like a jury already seated. The contrast weighed on him. His duty was civic order, but the asylum stood under the shield of the church. To question its practices was to question men of God, an act that could turn parishioners against him. Still, he could not ignore the mounting reports. Families whispered of kin who had been admitted and never spoken of again. Wagon drivers reported midnight lights over the graves. Even his own deputies confessed they avoided the asylum road after sundown. So Duval began his inquiry not through formal writs, but through private observation. He kept a small notebook, leather-bound and coded in a mix of shorthand and Creole phrases so that even if seized, it might resist easy reading. In its pages, still preserved in fragments, he sketched the cemetery layout, marking each fresh mound. He noted dates when neighbors reported hearing the tolling bell. He wrote initials of families who had asked about missing relatives. At the back of the notebook, he drew a crude map, aligning the asylum windows to the graves, adding a terse line, every gaze toward the dead intentional. Duval visited the asylum under the guise of routine oversight. The deacons received him with courtesy, offering a tour of the wards. They showed him narrow beds, prayer benches, a kitchen with meager stores. They insisted that their work was blessed, that the afflicted were calmer under their guidance. But Duval saw more than they intended. Iron locks on interior doors, patients thin as fence posts, attendants who flinched when spoken to. When he asked to see the death register, he was handed a ledger with entire pages left blank, save for a single line in elegant script, "The Lord gathers whom he will." That evening he recorded his impressions in code, care absent, records false. Window to grave, the sermon not accident. Suspect concealment of dead. His careful phrasing revealed his own inner conflict. Law demanded evidence, but instinct told him something darker was concealed. He began to question staff quietly. An attendant, cornered outside the parish store, admitted that burials took place at night, ordered by the deacons themselves. "No prayers, no names," the man whispered. "We lay them down quick before the dawn. Sometimes we don't even know the cause. Just told they are gone." Duval pressed him for names, but fear sealed the man's lips. The sheriff recorded only initials, J.H. The contrast grew sharper. Official reports painted Pilgrims Rest as a refuge, while Duval's notes revealed it as a factory of silence. He shared his suspicions with no one, not even his deputies, for to accuse without proof could ruin his post. Instead, he resolved to gather artifacts. He copied the blank ledgers line by line, then hid his notebook beneath loose boards in his office floor. From this point forward, Pilgrims Rest no longer appeared to him as a failed experiment, but as a deliberate machine. Its windows preached death, its cemetery filled without record, and its staff obeyed orders without question. Duval could feel the weight of something institutional, something more than neglect, an entire structure designed to erase the inconvenient. In later years, when fragments of his notebook were recovered, readers would marvel at his restraint. He did not declare the asylum haunted, nor call it criminal outright. He wrote only what he saw, graves, windows, silence. Yet in those sparse lines, the shape of a truth more terrifying than rumor emerged. In the summer of 1849, the sky over the parish split open with a storm that people would remember for decades. The cane fields bent flat under winds that roared like cannon fire, and the river swelled against the levee until families feared it would breach. Houses along the bayou nailed shutters tight, lamps extinguished to keep sparks from catching when lightning struck too near. In the midst of this chaos, Pilgrims Rest should have been as dark as the rest of the countryside. Its supply ledgers showed no oil deliveries for weeks, Neighbors knew the asylum had petitioned for funds, but been denied, and some attendants had been seen scrounging tallow scraps, just to keep a single hall lamp burning at night. Yet as the storm raged, a dozen witnesses swore that every window in the asylum glowed as though 100 lamps had been lit. The contrast could not be more alarming. The natural storm battering the parish matched against a building blazing with unnatural light. Farmers watching from their barns said it looked like a lantern vigil, each window burning golden against the rain. But no smoke rose from chimneys, no sparks leapt from lanterns carried outdoors. The light was steady, unwavering, immune to the gale. One man later told the sheriff, "It was as if the dead had lit their own candles and were standing, each at a pane, staring out into the storm." Mary Legrand's journal again provides testimony from within. She described the storm in fearful detail, the roar of the wind, the pounding rain, and then the sudden illumination of her ward. She wrote that she saw no attendant bring a lamp, yet the room grew bright enough to read her own hands. Every window, she claimed, glowed from without, not within, as though the cemetery itself had cast light back into the building. "It was the graves that shone," she wrote, "and we became shadows before them." Patients cried out in terror, some kneeling, some pressing against the glass. One man tore at his bedding and shouted that the storm had come for them at last. The attendants offered no explanation. In town, some whispered that lightning struck nearby and reflected in the panes, but the storm raged for hours and the glow never dimmed. Others claimed it was phosphorescence from swamp gases, though no one had ever seen such light before or after. Sheriff Duval, awakened by the thunder, rode out at dawn to inspect the asylum. He found the windows dull and ordinary, streaked with rain but dark within. When he asked the deacons, they shrugged and spoke of hysteria, insisting their lamps had remained unlit all night for want of oil. But Duval noted otherwise. In his coded notebook, he wrote of scorched marks on the floor beneath several windows, faint black crescents as if some flame had rested there. He interviewed 3 attendants separately. Each swore they saw brightness without flame. Their voices shook, but their stories matched. He wrote, "Light where none could be, no fuel, no wick, windows like beacons." The incident spread fear across the parish. To the faithful, it seemed confirmation that Pilgrims Rest was touched by forces beyond mortal control. To skeptics, it was evidence of deception, perhaps secret stores of oil hoarded for reasons unknown, perhaps deliberate illusion meant to awe or frighten. Either way, the asylum was no longer a quiet curiosity on the swamp's edge. It had become an active source of dread, a structure where the ordinary rules of night and day, fire and darkness, no longer applied. In the weeks after, children refused to walk past it even in daylight. Families pressed Sheriff Duval harder, asking if he would intervene. He knew he could not rely only on testimony. He needed written proof, institutional records to hold against the parish council and the deacons. And so he began to pry deeper, pressing for ledgers, examining accounts, hoping to uncover the paper trail that men of God might not have guarded as carefully as their walls. This third incident, the storm vigil, shifted suspicion into certainty. Something deliberate, something concealed, pulsed at the heart of Pilgrims Rest. And if the windows were indeed designed to face only the dead, the storm night suggested why. Not so the patients could gaze out, but so something could look in. Sheriff Duval understood that stories, no matter how many mouths repeated them, could be dismissed as hysteria. What could not be ignored was ink on paper, records kept by men who prided themselves on their orderliness and their devotion. After the storm vigil, when every window of Pilgrim's Rest had burned without fuel, Duval pressed harder. He invoked his role as parish lawman to request financial accounts, insisting he needed to verify that charitable funds were being managed properly. The deacons resisted at first, citing privacy of church records, but Duval persisted. He reminded them that the cemetery was parish property and that unexplained burials demanded explanation. Reluctantly, one deacon placed before him a bound ledger, the pages neat and numbered. It was meant to assure him that all was above board. Instead, it revealed the most damning clue yet. The ledger was written in a steady hand, each page marked with dates, suppliers, and sums. At first glance, the expenses seemed ordinary. Payments for timber, nails, lime for whitewashing, and modest food staples. But scattered between these, entries were unusual purchases, orders of cedar planks not suitable for construction but for coffin making, shipments of lime larger than any wall required, fees paid to a stone mason for dozens of headstones months before the asylum had opened its doors. Even more telling were notations of preparations that appeared in column after column, with amounts drawn from the asylum's charity fund. There were far more preparations recorded than documented deaths, a discrepancy too large to be oversight. The contrast was brutal. In sermons, the deacons spoke of healing the afflicted, but their ledger showed greater investment in graves than in food or medicine. For every barrel of cornmeal purchased, there were 2 headstones ordered. For every crate of blankets, there were shipments of pine boxes. The arithmetic itself became a confession. Duval copied several of the entries into his coded notebook, marking them with symbols only he understood. Yet he also noticed deliberate omissions. Whole weeks bore only the vague entry provisions, with no details attached. In other places, the amounts were crossed through, replaced by smaller sums, as though money had been siphoned elsewhere. When he pressed the deacon about these irregularities, the man grew stiff and replied, "The Lord requires no accounting to men." Duval did not argue, but in his mind, the words confirmed what the numbers already suggested. Pilgrims Rest was built less as a house of care than as a channel, funneling the living toward the graveyard. Among the ledger's pages, one stood out most of all. Beneath a date in early spring, long before the asylum admitted its first patient, an entry read simply, "For the watchers, oil and glass, to keep vigil." The sum was significant, enough to purchase lamps for every window. Yet no such lamps were ever seen. Duval underlined the phrase in his notes and added only a single question. Who are the watchers? That phrase would echo through later retellings of the asylum's history. But in that moment it was a private discovery, a scrap of evidence carried home by a sheriff already wary of speaking too boldly. He returned the ledger to the deacon, feigning satisfaction, but his thoughts churned. If the institution had been conceived from its very foundation as a place where windows faced only the cemetery, and if its funds were spent not on recovery but on burials, then perhaps the asylum was never a mistake. Perhaps it was built to serve the dead as much as the living. Duval wrote late that night by candlelight. His shorthand swift, ledgers town-proof, design intentional. Funds diverted, asylum for ceremony of death disguised as mercy. He folded the notebook closed, slid it beneath the floorboard once more and sat in silence, listening to the night wind stir through the cane. In his memory, he saw again the windows blazing against the storm, each one facing the cemetery like a lantern set for the dead. The ledger had not disproved the vision, it had explained it. This artifact, mundane in appearance yet damning in detail, became the first undeniable paper trail. It revealed not rumor, not hysteria, but arithmetic that spoke of intent. In the hands of Duval, it was proof enough to keep digging. In the hands of history, it survives as evidence that Pilgrims Rest was never a sanctuary, but a ledger balanced against human lives. In the autumn of 1849, not long after the storm vigil and Sheriff Duval's discovery of the ledger, an outsider entered the parish whose presence added another layer to the growing unease. His name was Dr. Nathaniel Halloran, a young alienist trained in New Orleans under physicians who embraced the new sciences of mind. He had studied the theories of Pinel and Esquirol, read foreign treatises on melancholy and mania, and believed the afflicted could be treated with observation rather than chains. When he heard of Pilgrims Rest during a lecture tour in Baton Rouge, he was intrigued. An institution so remote, founded by deacons rather than doctors, seemed an opportunity to test whether faith and medicine could coexist. What he found instead, recorded in the pages of his field notes, was a confirmation of Sheriff Duval's worst fears. Halloran wrote with the cool detachment of a clinician. He observed that the patients of Pilgrims Rest were unusually frail, their bodies thinned by malnutrition rather than by the disorders for which they had been confined. He noted the absence of medicinal stocks, no tinctures of laudanum, no powders of valerian, not even common herbs. Instead, he saw prayer schedules pinned to doors, verses recited as prescriptions, fasts imposed as penance. The afflicted are denied physi, he scribbled. They are treated as sinners first, patients second. The contrast could not have been more stark. Where his training called for care of the body and mind, the asylum substituted moral punishment, a regimen designed not to heal but to break. More troubling were the records of death. Halloran requested to see case files, expecting at least rudimentary notes of symptoms, progress, or decline. What he was shown instead were one-page slips, each bearing a name and age, and a single diagnosis repeated again and again: melancholia. No detail, no description, no observation, only the blanket term used to explain every passing, whether of a young boy or a grey-haired woman. To Halloran, this uniformity was not just laziness but concealment. In his notebook he wrote, "Melancholia wielded as hammer. Every soul made to fit the same coffin of words." He attempted to interview several patients. Mary Legrand he met briefly. Noting her thin frame and lucid expression of grief, he judged her far from insane. "A woman in mourning, articulate and clear," he recorded. "Her confinement unjustified." Another patient, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, recounted night terrors of cannon fire, but insisted he was otherwise sound. Halloran wrote, shell-shocked perhaps, but coherent. No cause for incarceration. His verdict, written in his formal report, was damning. Most of the patients were not mad, but merely inconvenient to their families or the parish. The doctor also recorded his impressions of the building itself. He described the windows, aligned to the cemetery, and confessed that their uniformity disturbed him. He noted how patients often sat at them for hours, not out of preference but compulsion, as if ordered by the design itself. "It is as though the asylum is an observatory," he wrote, "but its telescope points only to the grave." His language, though clinical, betrayed unease. Environment engineered not for cure, but for indoctrination. To stare at death is their daily therapy. Halloran's final notes carry the weight of both evidence and resignation. He concluded that the asylum was failing in its duty, that it served not health but ritual. He recommended immediate medical oversight and reform. Yet he knew such words would carry little weight in a parish where church authority outranked medical science. "The physician speaks," he lamented, "but the deacon commands." His field book, preserved in fragments among his later papers, serves as a fourth artifact, a testament that an educated outsider, with no ties to the parish, saw through the veneer and judged the place not merely ineffective, but dangerous. This too sharpened the contrast at the heart of Pilgrims Rest, the conflict between emerging science and entrenched faith, between those who sought to treat the mind and those who sought to bury its discomforts. Where Halloran saw patients in need of care, the asylum saw souls already consigned to death. His testimony added to Duval's ledger and Mary's journal a third strand of proof, making the pattern harder to deny. Yet still the parish council refused to act. The deacons dismissed Halloran as a meddler, a man too quick to label sorrow as disease. They sent him away with polite words, and the asylum continued its routines unchanged. But his presence stirred Sheriff Duval to a new resolve. If the church ignored both testimony and science, then force alone might reveal the truth. By the winter of 1850, Sheriff Etienne Duval knew that words and paper would never be enough. He had Mary Legrand's trembling testimony, though she had since vanished. He had the strange ledger with its arithmetic of graves, and he had Dr. Halloran's field notes, clinical and damning. But against the authority of the church, against the sermons preached each Sunday about sacrifice and redemption, these proofs were like pebbles hurled at a fortress wall. The parish murmured, restless but uncertain, until one night a farmer's boy stumbled into town, half-frozen, babbling that he had seen figures carrying bodies out of Pilgrims Rest by lantern light. That story spread like fire through dry cane. Within a week, Duval had the backing he needed. Men gathered with lanterns, muskets, and spades. They would not petition the council, nor beg the deacons for answers. They would force the matter open. The air on the night of the raid was sharp with frost, unusual for Louisiana. The company moved in silence. A contrast to the sermons of peace the asylum had always wrapped itself in. Faith against doubt, silence against accusation, the two poles collided as Duval led his men up the hill to Pilgrims Rest. From a distance, The asylum looked as it always had, its whitewashed walls, its rows of windows like pale eyes, all gazing toward the cemetery. Yet as they drew nearer, they saw that every window was dark. The building offered no sign of life, though the graveyard behind it glimmered faintly, as though moonlight clung longer there than anywhere else. Duval ordered 2 deputies to secure the doors. They found them unlocked. Inside, the halls echoed hollow, the scent of lime and old wood rising from the floorboards. Beds were stripped bare, their straw scattered as if in haste. Not a patient remained. Not even the attendants who once scurried through the wards could be found. In their place were only traces, ropes cut and left dangling, a prayer bench overturned, a child's doll lying abandoned in the corner of a cell. It was as if the asylum had been evacuated in a single night. The men searched room by room, their lanterns swinging shadows across the walls. They found no bodies, yet the silence itself felt like an accusation. One deputy called out that he had discovered a locked door in the cellar. Duval descended with 2 volunteers, their lanterns barely cutting the dark. The door was thick, iron-banded. When they forced it open with musket butts, the smell of damp stone and earth wafted out. Inside they found ledgers, dozens of them stacked on shelves, each one filled with the same spare entries, melancholia, melancholia, melancholia. But where the upstairs ledger had been neat and orderly, these were crowded with initials, numbers, and symbols. Some pages bore faint stains, brown and irregular. Deeper still, they uncovered what would later be whispered of as the inventory room. Here lay coffins, stacked and unfinished, lids leaning against walls, headstones without names, their dates already carved but blank beneath, stood in neat rows against the far corner. Each stone bore the same year, 1849, as though the asylum had prepared in advance for deaths that had not yet occurred. One man dropped his lantern in shock, and Duval barked at him to hold steady. The flame guttered, then rose again, casting its light across the grim stockpile of a death factory. The men fled the cellar with their findings, but Duval alone forced himself to linger, copying a few lines from the hidden ledgers into his notebook before the others slammed the door shut. He could not deny the evidence any longer. This was not care gone wrong. This was premeditation. Pilgrims Rest had prepared graves before patients ever filled the beds. The contrast was too sharp, too damning. A house built under the banner of mercy that functioned only as a machine of erasure. When the townsfolk returned to the main hall, they found the chapel lamp burning, though no one had lit it. It glowed coldly without smoke, illuminating the altar. Upon it lay a single book, open to a verse underlined in heavy ink. Blessed are they who watch in silence, for they shall be spared. No one confessed to placing it there. The men carried it out as further proof, though many would later say it cursed their homes. By dawn the asylum stood abandoned, its secrets partly unearthed yet unresolved. The deacons themselves were gone. The patients had vanished too. Whether released, relocated, or buried, no one could say. What remained were artifacts, ledgers, and the memory of empty windows staring at the graves. That night, Duval sealed his notebook with a final line beneath his coded entries. The house is hollow yet full. The windows still watch. It was the beginning of the aftermath, when the parish had to decide whether to admit the truth or bury it once again, beneath silence. Morning came to Pilgrims Rest, not with clarity but with dread. The raiding party, though they had torn open cellar doors and carried away ledgers, felt no triumph. Their faces were drawn, their eyes downcast as they descended the hill. It was as though the asylum had expelled them, rather than surrendered to them. Sheriff Duval rode at their head, the only sound the creak of saddles and the soft clop of hooves on frozen earth. Behind them the asylum loomed, its windows reflecting the pale dawn, blank and unyielding. The men carried proof. Yes, ledgers inked with lies, unfinished coffins, headstones awaiting names, but in their hearts they carried shame. They had seen too much and understood too little. In the days that followed, the parish council met in hushed sessions. Duval presented his findings formally, the blank registers, the cellar stockpiles, the underlined verse left upon the altar. He even read passages from Dr. Halloran's field notes, which he had secured by courier. Yet the councilmen, many of them seated in the very pews of the deacons who had founded the asylum, shifted uneasily and said little. One suggested the records might have been misfiled. Another claimed the coffins were merely prudent preparation for epidemics. A third muttered that the sheriff's witnesses had been unnerved by shadows. The more Duval pressed, the more they recoiled. The contrast was unbearable. Citizens demanded truth, yet their leaders sought only silence. Soon an official decree was issued. The asylum was to be shuttered, the grounds sanctified anew, and all ledgers placed under seal in the parish archive. No charges would be brought against the missing deacons. No search would be made for vanished patients. The matter was to be declared closed, a chapter written off as mismanagement rather than malevolence. Duval was ordered to return the artifacts he had seized. Though he complied, he copied each one again into his coded notebook, unwilling to let the truth dissolve completely. For the townsfolk, whispers replaced testimony. Mothers warned their children not to climb the hill where the windows watched. Farmers avoided the road past the cemetery. When new graves appeared, no one asked who had been buried. It was easier to look away, easier to pretend that the asylum had never existed. Memory itself became another institution, burying what law and church would not name. Duval carried the weight alone. He had done what law permitted, yet it was not enough. At night, he returned to his hidden notebook, turning the pages as if seeking a pattern he had missed. On one page, he had copied the underlined verse from the altar book. "Blessed are they who watch in silence, for they shall be spared." Beneath it, he scrawled his own reflection. Perhaps the whole parish has taken this to heart. Silence is its only sanctuary. The artifacts, now sealed in archives, became inert by decree. They were labeled and stored, their boxes locked away, their contents forbidden to researchers. Decades later, when scholars stumbled upon fragments, they found pages missing, ink scrubbed, names erased. It was not time that had faded the records, but deliberate hands. What remains to us now are echoes, Mary's journal pages, Duval's coded fragments, Halloran's field notes, all incomplete, all scarred by censorship. The erasure is itself proof of the horror. The aftermath was not one of justice, but of suppression. Where there should have been reckoning, there was forgetting. Where there should have been memorial, there was denial. In the official story, Pilgrims Rest was a failed experiment, nothing more. In the whispered story, it was a house built for the dead, its windows gazing only on graves. And in Duval's private pages, hidden until long after his death, it was both sanctuary and snare, faith and cruelty, life and death, each reflected in those blank panes of glass. Time has a way of softening edges, but with Pilgrims Rest, the years only sharpened the outline of its absence. By the late 19th century, the asylum itself had been pulled down, its timbers sold, its stones carted away for barns and mills. Only the cemetery remained, rows of tilted markers half swallowed by cane and briar. Travelers who paused on the parish road remarked that all the stones seemed to lean toward the hill where the asylum once stood, as though even in death the buried could not look away. The place became a void in the local map, unmarked and unmentioned, yet never entirely erased. The story survived in fragments. Duval's notebook, found beneath the floorboards of his office decades after his death, contained coded lines that scholars still debate. Mary Legrand's journal surfaced in the trunk of a plantation family. Its ink faded but legible, recounting the bells at midnight and the whispered prayers for those not yet dead. Halloran's field notes, scattered among his medical papers, offered clinical confirmation that the patients were never insane at all, merely unwanted. Each fragment served as an artifact, scraps of proof in a history that had tried to bury itself. The contrasts remain the most haunting element of the tale. A house that claimed to heal but prepared only graves. Windows built for light, yet turned exclusively toward darkness. Deacons who preached compassion, but purchased coffins in advance. Parish leaders who swore to guard their flock, yet sealed away the evidence. Pilgrims Rest sits forever between sanctuary and snare, an institution remembered not for mercy, but for silence. Modern listeners cannot escape the philosophical weight of the story. What do we owe the afflicted among us? Is faith a shelter or a shroud when it denies care? How easily can an institution transform into a mechanism of disappearance when its power goes unchecked? These questions outlast the ruins, outlast the ledgers, outlast even the bones beneath the ground. The case of Pilgrims Rest is less about ghosts than about erasure. the deliberate, sanctioned forgetting of lives deemed inconvenient. And so the windows still haunt us, though the walls that framed them are gone. Every pane faced the cemetery, as if reminding both patient and passerby that there was no return. No healing, only burial. Whether this was architecture of faith or cruelty may never be settled. But the fact remains, every soul who entered was made to gaze upon the grave that waited. As with all stories drawn from fragment and rumor, we must step carefully. This account is reconstructed from incomplete records, from testimony altered by fear, from artifacts that survived only by chance. It is not offered as spectacle but as memorial. The dead deserve not silence but remembrance, not blank ledgers but names restored. And so we leave you with the question that Sheriff Duval once scrawled beneath his coded notes, a question that echoes across time. If silence spares us, is survival worth the price of forgetting? Wherever you are listening from, consider what stories your own town hides. What windows in your community stare only at graves? Share them if you can, for only in telling are the forgotten brought back to light. Though the formal account of Pilgrims Rest ends with its demolition, history has a way of breathing through what cannot be contained. After the parish ordered the asylum dismantled in the 1870s, men carted away its stones, its beams, its ironwork. Yet wherever those pieces were carried, stories seemed to follow. A barn built from the asylum's timber burned twice in 1 decade. A mill constructed from its stones collapsed, killing a laborer who, according to rumor, had once hauled bodies from the hill. These were dismissed as accidents, but among locals, they were whispered of as proof that Pilgrims Rest had never been fully destroyed. The contrast was striking. Material structure erased, intangible memory more solid than ever. Families who had once buried kin in its cemetery continued to avoid the place. Some refused to walk within sight of the hill, claiming that even after the windows were gone, one could feel a gaze pressing from the earth. Travelers spoke of seeing pale lights among the headstones, as though lanterns still moved silently there. An itinerant preacher claimed he heard the toll of a bell, though the chapel and its steeple had long since been torn down. Parish officials issued statements dismissing these tales as superstition, but their very insistence betrayed discomfort. In archives, the sealed ledgers gathered dust, but scholars who later obtained access to them noted odd mutilations. Pages were missing, corners sliced away, names blotted into illegibility. One archivist, writing in 1912, confessed privately in a letter to a colleague that he believed the records had been surgically censored, perhaps by hands seeking to hide the magnitude of the graves. His letter, too, survives as an artifact, fragile and yellowed, another sliver of proof that forgetting was not accidental but imposed. The most haunting testimonies came from descendants of those once confined. Oral histories gathered in the 1930s under federal folklore. Projects reveal fragments. An old woman remembering how her aunt went up the hill to pray and never came back. A man describing how his grandfather saw the windows shine when there was no moon. These stories were told with embarrassment, as if confessing something shameful yet necessary, as if their family histories bore scars they could not erase. Again the contrast presses, official silence against stubborn folk memory. The parish's attempt at erasure against the persistence of grief. By the mid-20th century, the cemetery had been almost swallowed by cane and pine. Yet even then, local children dared one another to walk among its stones, claiming that each marker leaned slightly toward where the asylum once stood. When photographs were taken, shadows fell oddly across the frames, darker than the surrounding daylight. No proof, only suggestion. Still, the suggestion was enough to keep the story alive. The fate of Sheriff Duval's notebook ties the epilogue back to its source. For decades it was considered lost. Then, in the 1960s, a section of his office floor was removed during renovation, and beneath it lay a small tin box. Inside was the coded volume, pages brittle but intact. Historians puzzled over his shorthand, slowly reconstructing his method. They found his sketches of the cemetery, his transcriptions of ledger entries, his reflection that the house is hollow, yet full. That discovery reignited interest in Pilgrims Rest, ensuring the asylum's memory could never again be wholly buried. In this way, the story has passed from parish rumor to archival fragment to scholarly inquiry, each stage reshaping its legacy. The institution that once thrived on silence now survives only because silence was broken by Mary's journal, Halloran's notes, Duval's secret writings, and the voices of descendants who refused to forget. What was once concealed has become a mirror for later generations, a reminder of how easily charity can mask cruelty, and how institutions sanctified by faith can become instruments of death. The windows may no longer stand, but their direction remains fixed in memory. Always toward the cemetery, always toward the grave. That orientation, that architectural sermon in wood and glass, continues to haunt us. It is a reminder that structures are never neutral. They teach, they command, they shape the living into forms of belief. At Pilgrims Rest, the lesson was simple and terrible. Every path led to the earth, and every eye was turned toward it. Even as the last physical traces of Pilgrims Rest crumbled into the soil, the story refused to lie still. By the late 20th century, scholars, journalists, and even amateur genealogists began piecing together what parish officials had spent more than a century trying to bury. Their work was often quiet, conducted in libraries and archives, but what they uncovered reignited old questions with new urgency. The contrast that defined the asylum, faith against science, sanctuary against snare, re-emerged now as history against forgetting, remembrance against deliberate erasure. University researchers in the 1970s, working through federal grants, began to revisit asylum histories across the American South. In Louisiana, their attention inevitably turned to the enigmatic references to Pilgrims Rest in parish reports. What they found were blank gaps, decades of missing census records, death rolls without names, property ledgers with entries blotted out. One historian described the archive as an intentional void, a silence written in ink. That phrase became a kind of thesis for later study. Pilgrims Rest was remembered not for what it revealed, but for what it concealed. Archaeologists joined the search, and in 1983, a small survey was conducted near the overgrown cemetery. Ground penetrating, instruments revealed far more disturbances in the soil than the number of markers suggested. Beneath the earth lay rows of unmarked graves, stretching farther than the cemetery wall. The team concluded that the cemetery had doubled in size underground. Parish authorities quickly restricted further digging, citing respect for the dead, but the discovery itself was confirmation. The institution had buried more than anyone admitted. The land had become an artifact, a record etched not in paper but in soil. At the same time, oral historians collected testimonies from descendants of those linked to the asylum. One woman recalled a family tradition that her great-grandmother had been sent up the hill for sorrow after losing 3 children to fever. She never returned. Another man told of his ancestor, a war veteran, who was admitted for nightmares and was never heard from again. These stories, though unverifiable in official registers, resonated with Halloran's century-old notes. The survivors' descendants gave voice to those who had been silenced, reasserting identity where ledgers had imposed only melancholia. Media interest followed. Documentarians filmed the leaning gravestones, capturing footage of the eerie geometry that made every marker tilt toward the vanished asylum. Journalists interviewed parish elders, some of whom spoke reluctantly, others with bitterness that their families had been shamed into silence for generations. Each retelling sharpened the philosophical sting. How could a community that prided itself on piety collude in such forgetting? How could silence be mistaken for mercy? Yet even as these truths surfaced, resistance remained. Parish officials insisted that too much attention disturbed the sanctity of the dead. Churches argued that dredging up the asylum's past was an attack on faith itself. The contrast between remembrance and denial grew sharper with every decade. Scholars published articles, but parish newspapers printed rebuttals. Families erected makeshift memorials at the cemetery fence, only to find them removed days later. The struggle over memory had become as contested as the asylum itself once was. Artifacts carried the weight of proof. Duval's notebook, preserved in a university collection, was translated line by line. Its coded shorthand revealed as meticulous documentation. Halloran's field notes were digitized, and made available to medical historians, who pointed out how accurately he had anticipated later understandings of trauma. Mary Legrand's journal pages were displayed in a museum. Exhibition on women's voices, silenced by institutions. Each artifact undermined the parish's attempts to forget, each piece of ink forcing recognition where silence had reigned. And yet, for all this, the mystery of intent remained unsolved. Did the deacons truly believe they were sparing the afflicted? Or had they built the asylum as a calculated engine of disappearance? Was Pilgrims Rest a product of misguided faith or deliberate cruelty? Historians divided, some emphasizing cultural context, others reading the architecture and ledgers as evidence of premeditation. The ambiguity persists, a tension between innocence and guilt, mistake and malice. By the turn of the millennium, Pilgrims Rest had become both a cautionary tale and a contested memory. Its cemetery still leaned, its archives still whispered, its story still unsettled. The windows that once reflected the graveyard no longer stood, but their orientation remained a metaphor, fixed in the collective imagination, always toward death, always away from life. By the early 21st century, Pilgrims Rest was no longer a local legend confined to parish whispers. It had become a subject of national inquiry, a case study cited in conferences on medical ethics, institutional abuse, and the politics of silence. What had once been dismissed as rumor and superstition now sat alongside the histories of infamous poorhouses and state hospitals. The contrast was striking. A forgotten Louisiana asylum, once erased from its own records, now elevated as evidence in global debates about how societies treat their most vulnerable. Historians began to frame Pilgrims Rest not only as a tragedy of faith and mismanagement, but as a pattern recognizable across centuries. Institutions built under banners of mercy, whether cloaked in scripture, medicine, or public good, often carried within them the seeds of neglect and disappearance. Where the asylum had replaced medicine with prayer and silence, modern parallels emerged in orphanages, detention centers, and hospitals that rationed care by wealth or race. The question was not whether Pilgrims Rest was unique, but whether it was an early warning ignored. The artifacts served as anchors in these discussions. Duval's coded notebook, now digitized, circulated among criminologists as a rare example of a local lawman attempting to preserve truth against official suppression. Halloran's notes found new relevance among psychiatrists who hailed his recognition of trauma as decades ahead of its time. Mary Legrand's journal became emblematic of women, whose grief was pathologized rather than respected, a theme painfully resonant, with modern debates about whose voices are dismissed as hysterical. Each artifact spoke across time, collapsing the distance between 1849 and the present. Philosophers and ethicists pressed further, reading Pilgrims Rest as a parable of forgetting. The parish had survived not because it faced its own cruelty, but because it buried it. Leaders had sealed records, raised buildings, and declared silence a virtue. This, scholars argued, was not just a local failing but a universal temptation to protect the appearance of piety or progress by burying the evidence of harm. In this sense, the asylum's windows were not relics of architecture, but symbols of willful orientation, society choosing to look only toward the grave, never toward reform. Yet others warned against turning Pilgrims Rest into mere metaphor. Real bodies had been buried there, real lives erased. The danger of philosophical distance was that it might excuse the specificity of the suffering. Oral historians returned to the parish again, interviewing descendants who still felt shame attached to family names lost in the ledgers. "They told us never to speak of her," one man said of his great-aunt. "They said she died of sorrow, but I think she was locked away for speaking too much." In such testimonies, the echoes of the asylum still lived, raw and unresolved. The tension between abstraction and lived memory gave the story its modern power. On one side, Pilgrims Rest stood as a lens through which to critique institutions of the present. On the other, it remained a wound for those whose kin were consumed by its silence. That duality, the universal against the particular, ensured that the asylum could never be comfortably archived. It was both symbol and scar, both history and ongoing inheritance. By the time documentaries and podcasts began to broadcast its tale to global audiences, Pilgrims Rest had become more than an obscure Louisiana asylum. It was a mirror. Its lesson was not confined to 1849, but asked something pressing of the present. How many windows do our own institutions still aim towards cemeteries, instructing us to accept disappearance as inevitable? And so the philosophical epilogue took shape, not as closure but as an opening. Pilgrims Rest forced audiences to ask not what had happened, but what continues to happen when silence is mistaken for mercy. The closing meditation begins not in the parish archives, but in the present moment, with the lingering question of what Pilgrims Rest means for us now. It is tempting when hearing such a story to place it at a safe distance, an old asylum long gone, in a corner of Louisiana most listeners will never visit, yet the power of its memory lies in refusing that distance. The contrasts that shaped Pilgrims Rest, faith against medicine, silence against testimony, disappearance against remembrance, are not locked in the year 1849. They remain alive wherever institutions hold sway over vulnerable lives, wherever secrecy is defended as virtue. The asylum's windows, all oriented toward the cemetery, stand as a symbol that cannot be ignored. They remind us how architecture itself can be a moral choice. To build a house of care that constantly directed its residents toward death was to inscribe despair into the very structure of daily life. And though the building has long since fallen, we must ask, how many of our modern institutions carry the same unspoken message, designed in ways that isolate rather than restore, conceal rather than confess? The asylum becomes less a ruin of the past and more a blueprint warning us of the present. Artifacts remain the truest rebuttal to erasure. Duval's coded ledger, Halloran's clinical notes, Mary Legrand's fragile journal, each is a voice that the parish tried to still but could not. Their survival is not an accident. It is a kind of resistance, a proof that silence can be broken even after a century. The lesson is simple but profound. Records matter, testimonies matter. The smallest scrap of ink can undo decades of forgetting. As we live in an age where archives are digital and deletions instantaneous, Pilgrims Rest warns us that the struggle between truth and concealment has only grown sharper. The survivors' descendants also hold the final word. Their interviews, halting and sorrowful, remind us that the past is not past. Shame is inherited, silence is taught, but memory persists. One woman, when asked why she had chosen to speak publicly after her family kept quiet for 4 generations, said, "Because she deserves her name back." That statement might be the true epitaph of Pilgrims Rest, not dates or diagnoses, but the reclamation of a name, the refusal to let silence have the last word. And so the story arrives at its moral edge. Institutions fail when they protect themselves at the expense of those they claim to serve. Communities fail when they confuse forgetting with forgiveness. Faith fails when it cannot distinguish between mercy and control. The cemetery-facing windows were not only architectural features but ethical positions, visible in wood and glass. They show us that every society must choose where to face its gaze, toward the graves it digs, or toward the lives it might yet preserve. For the audience, the question now is direct. How should we respond to such a history? Should we treat it as a curiosity, a dark footnote in the annals of Louisiana, or should we let it unsettle us, forcing us to look at the places where our own systems, whether hospitals, prisons or churches, might be repeating the same patterns of silence? Pilgrims Rest does not offer comfort, but it does offer clarity. It insists that every window is a choice. And so, as the story closes, the challenge is placed in your hands. What do you see when you look at the windows of your own world? Do they face the living, or do they too face the cemetery? The legacy of Pilgrims Rest does not end in the cemetery where its dead were laid. It lingers in the way communities choose to remember or refuse to remember what happened there. After the last remnants of the asylum collapsed into ruin, the parish made no official memorial, no plaque to mark the site, no acknowledgement of those who lived and died behind its walls. The silence was intentional, a continuation of the same pattern that defined the institution itself. In this, the parish mirrored many societies across history. the instinct to bury shame alongside the bodies, to cover failure with foliage and time. The contrast is clear. Remembrance demands courage, but forgetting offers convenience. Yet forgetting is never complete. The earth, the artifacts, and the descendants refuse to allow Pilgrims Rest to vanish. Archaeologists and historians reassembled fragments of truth, while families whispered stories that stretched across generations. Each recovered name, each unearthed ledger line, became a small act of defiance against erasure. This is what gives the asylum's story its haunting endurance. The institution tried to define lives as disposable, but memory resurrected them in unexpected ways. What was meant to remain silent became a subject of global debate, proof that the dead do not stay hidden when the living demand answers. By the 21st century, Pilgrims Rest had become a teaching tool. University syllabi invoked it when addressing medical ethics. Students in theology courses debated its perversion of Christian mercy, and sociologists studied it as a microcosm of institutional betrayal. The windows facing the cemetery were interpreted as both literal design and metaphorical indictment. The building itself had collapsed, but its symbolism grew stronger with every retelling. It stood as a warning. Institutions built without accountability are destined to face the graves they create. Still, conflict persisted in the parish. Attempts to erect a modest memorial at the cemetery's edge were met with resistance from church leaders, who argued that disturbing the dead reopened old wounds, better left closed. Others claimed that outsiders exaggerated the asylum's failures to tarnish the parish's reputation. Here again, the contrast sharpened: reverence for the dead versus refusal to honor them, acknowledgement versus denial, healing versus concealment. Pilgrims Rest, even in absence, divided those who lived in its shadow. For descendants of the forgotten, the lack of acknowledgement was a second injury. One woman explained that every time she walked past the cemetery, she felt the weight of a relative buried in an unmarked grave. They told me her sorrow was contagious, she said. But what is contagious is the silence. Her words transformed private grief into public indictment, demonstrating how intergenerational silence perpetuates trauma. The parish may have raised the asylum, but its moral architecture persisted in the lives of those left behind. The lesson is not confined to Louisiana. Around the world, audiences who encounter this story recognize echoes of their own histories. Homes for unwed mothers in Ireland, state hospitals in New England, residential schools in Canada. Pilgrims Rest is no isolated aberration. It is a mirror reflecting a global pattern of institutions built on promises of care but delivering, suffering through secrecy. The asylum's cemetery-facing windows are therefore not just a local curiosity but an architectural shorthand for betrayal itself. And so the legacy crystallizes into a demand. To speak of Pilgrims Rest today is to choose remembrance over forgetting, testimony over silence, responsibility over denial. Its story cannot bring back the lives it consumed, but it can challenge us to question the institutions we inherit and the narratives we accept. Every listener, every reader, every descendant stands before the same choice faced by the parish long ago: to turn away from the graves or to face them directly and name what lies beneath. What gives Pilgrims Rest its enduring power is not simply the tragedy of those who perished within its walls, but the universality of its warning. It is a case study in how institutions meant to safeguard the vulnerable can instead become instruments of disappearance. The contrast that animated every page of its history, sanctuary versus snare, faith versus cruelty, remembrance versus erasure, extends far beyond a Louisiana hillside in 1849. It is the same contrast that haunts societies whenever the language of care masks the mechanics of control. Historians note that the asylum story reads almost archetypally. A group of leaders convinced of their righteousness, a building raised with solemn ceremony, a community reassured that sorrow would be safely contained. The intent may not have been overtly malicious at first, but intent proved irrelevant to outcome. The architecture itself betrayed the truth: windows fixed toward the graveyard, corridors that led to silence, a design that spoke more of confinement than cure. The lesson here is profound. Good intentions, when unchecked by transparency and accountability, can solidify into structures of harm. Modern parallels are unsettling. Prisons branded as rehabilitation centers, hospitals rationing care by wealth, refugee camps described as temporary, shelters yet existing for decades, each carries its own version of cemetery-facing windows. Pilgrims Rest warns us that these designs are never neutral. They orient not only the bodies within, but the conscience of the community outside. When we build institutions without oversight, without listening to those inside them, we are choosing, whether knowingly or not, to face our windows toward graves. The artifacts continue to whisper this warning. Duval's careful ledger, a lone sheriff's stand against erasure, illustrates how individuals can resist, even when institutions collude. Halloran's medical notes remind us that truth often exists, waiting to be recognized, even if ignored by authority. Mary Legrand's journal, written in fragile ink, stands as a monument to grief misinterpreted as illness. Together they show that silence is never total. It can be cracked by the persistence of records, by the refusal to let ink fade, by the courage to preserve fragments against destruction. For philosophers and ethicists, Pilgrims Rest represents the crossroads of memory and morality. Do we treat its story as a singular relic, an oddity of 19th century Louisiana? Or do we acknowledge it as a pattern, an indictment of human tendency to hide our cruelties behind architecture, ritual, and euphemism? To dismiss it as distant history turns to let the windows remain fixed toward the cemetery. To confront it is to reorient our gaze toward life, toward accountability, toward the possibility of doing better. The cemetery remains, uneven stones tilting in the weeds, a silent reminder of what was once deliberately hidden. But those stones are no longer mute. Each leans outward as if insisting on attention, each testifying that the dead have not been forgotten. Their very persistence becomes a form of protest, an argument against the parish's silence. The question is not whether Pilgrims Rest still speaks, but whether we are willing to listen. And so the story broadens from the particular to the universal. Pilgrims Rest is not only about Louisiana, not only about 1849, it is about the perennial danger of sanctioned silence, the way societies sacrifice the inconvenient for the appearance of order. It is about the moral architecture of our institutions, the choices encoded into the very direction of their windows. Above all, it is about us, the listeners, the readers, the inheritors of this history, who must decide whether to repeat its pattern or to break it. The story of Pilgrim's Rest narrows now into its final turn, where history ceases to be distant and becomes instead a mirror held up to the present. After more than a century of silence, the question is no longer what happened in that asylum on the Louisiana hillside. It is what we, as inheritors of that knowledge, choose to do with it. The contrast is sharper here than anywhere else. Passivity versus responsibility. Forgetting versus remembrance. Denial versus confrontation. Pilgrim's Rest leaves no neutral ground. The cemetery-facing windows, which seemed once like an architectural curiosity, emerge in this light as a moral compass. Every society builds its own version of such windows, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical. They are found in the placement of hospital wards, in the design of detention centers, in the invisible algorithms of welfare systems. All bear the same question: do we design for dignity or for disappearance? Pilgrims Rest forces us to see that the angle of a window can reflect the angle of a conscience. The documents and testimonies that survived, the coded sheriff's ledger, the alienist's case notes, the journal of the grieving mother, remind us that truth does not erase itself easily. It waits in the margins, often fragile until someone chooses to read it. Each artifact is both evidence and invitation, evidence of what happened, and invitation to recognize its pattern in our own institutions. To ignore them is to repeat the parish's mistake, protecting reputation over reckoning. Philosophers argue that history's greatest utility is not in its details but in its demands. Pilgrim's Rest demands vigilance. It demands that we question not only what happened then, but what is happening now behind the closed doors of facilities that claim to heal, protect, or reform. It insists that we do not mistake quietness for peace or silence for mercy, Those windows aligned toward the cemetery taught their lesson with brutal clarity. An institution that faces only toward death cannot offer life. For those who carry family ties to the asylum, this lesson is not abstract. It is personal, inscribed in shame, in unspoken absences at family tables, in names erased from genealogies. Their courage to speak after generations of silence is itself a confrontation of the past. They remind us that remembrance is not just academic, it is an act of justice, a refusal to let the dead remain nameless. And so the story circles back to us. We are asked not only to acknowledge what was, but to examine what is. Where do our own windows face? Which institutions have we built that lean toward convenience rather than compassion? Toward concealment rather than clarity? In what ways are we still burying our failures instead of naming them? The answers may not be comfortable, but comfort was never the promise of Pilgrims Rest. Its promise, if one can call it that, is a mirror, demanding that we see ourselves as clearly as we now see the asylum. The asylum is gone, the cemetery remains, and the story continues. Whether it becomes a cautionary tale, honored by remembrance, or a pattern repeated through neglect depends not on the past but on the choices made now. The final question rests with us. Do we continue to face the cemetery, or do we turn the windows toward life? This is where the story closes, though it cannot truly end. Pilgrims Rest, raised on a Louisiana hillside in 1848 and torn down decades later, stands as more than brick and timber. It is a parable carved into the memory of a place and now into the conscience of anyone who hears it. The asylum was built under the banner of mercy, yet its walls bore witness to silence, neglect, and disappearance. Its windows, each one fixed toward the cemetery, embodied the final truth of its mission: to turn sorrow away from the living and consign it to the grave. The structure has collapsed, the parish has changed, and the names of those who died are mostly lost, but the warning remains as urgent as ever. What Pilgrims Rest teaches us is that forgetting is not forgiveness. The parish tried to bury its failure in weeds and time, but the earth refused to comply. Records surfaced, artifacts spoke, descendants remembered. History, even when silenced, has a way of pushing back, demanding to be heard. And when it does, it lays bare not only the cruelty of a past institution, but the vulnerabilities of our own. The contrast is sobering. We can choose remembrance and responsibility, or we can repeat the cycle of concealment and betrayal. The artifacts serve as a kind of chorus in this closing act. Duval's coded ledger still whispers the duty of bearing witness when others conspire to forget. Halloran's meticulous notes remind us that knowledge can exist long before it is recognized, and that dismissal of truth is itself a kind of violence. Mary Legrand's journal remains the most intimate proof. A cry of grief misread as madness, a human life reduced to diagnosis, yet preserved by the fragile resilience of ink. Each of these voices survived against the odds, not because institutions protected them, but because individuals chose to keep them. That choice, the refusal to erase, is the one the present must make as well. There is also a responsibility in telling this story. It cannot be used to sensationalize suffering, nor to exploit tragedy as entertainment. It must be told with sobriety, with empathy, with acknowledgement of those who endured it. This is why a content warning was placed at the start, to remind us that the horrors of history are not fables, but realities endured by real people whose memory deserves reverence. Pilgrims Rest is not a ghost story, though it haunts. It is not a legend, though it has been whispered like one. It is a record of choices and of consequences. And now the mirror turns. The question is no longer, what happened at Pilgrims Rest? We know. The question is, what are we doing now that echoes it? Are our institutions transparent, accountable, humane? Or are their windows still oriented toward the cemetery, their corridors still aligned with silence? Have we learned to listen to the vulnerable, or do we still pathologize their cries? Do we keep meticulous records to honor their lives, or do we let ledgers fill with euphemisms and omissions? Pilgrims Rest insists on vigilance. It reminds us that the past is never as distant as it seems, that silence can be inherited, that forgetting can be fatal. Its cemetery-facing windows are both relic and metaphor, pointing us toward the grave unless we deliberately turn them toward life. To listen to this story is to inherit its responsibility, to resist silence, to preserve testimony, to remember names even when institutions would erase them. So the final reflection is offered not as closure, but as challenge. Pilgrims Rest asks you to look at the structures in your own world, hospitals, schools, prisons, churches, shelters, and ask where their windows face. To examine whether they are places of true sanctuary, or whether they too are aligned with disappearance. To recognize that every act of remembering is an act of resistance, and that remembrance is the first step toward justice. The asylum is gone, but the choice remains. Will we continue to turn our gaze toward graves, or will we reorient our windows toward life?